This is a story about a haunting at a funeral in Vietnam. Before we start, please hit like and subscribe for more stories like this. The first thing Ahn Tran remembered was not the coffin or the candles or the sound of crying inside the funeral house. It was his wife on whispering very softly. There is a woman standing behind the altar and nobody is looking at her. Dom turned because that was what any husband would do when his wife said something like that. But behind the altar, there was only incense smoke, yellow funeral flowers, bowls of rice, fruit, tea, and the framed photograph of their friend, Minh Quang, who had died 3 nights earlier in a car accident outside Hoi An. The funeral was crowded, but still somehow lonely. People came and went in waves, carrying white headbands, paper money, and quiet guilt. Min's mother sat near the coffin with her hands folded so tightly that her knuckles had gone pale. Every few minutes, someone would light incense, bow 3 times, and step back as if the smoke itself was a doorway. Dom and Ahn had known Min since they were teenagers. Min had been loud, funny, always late, always smiling, the kind of man who could make strangers feel like cousins before a bowl of noodles was finished. Seeing him in a black and white photograph, surrounded by candles, made Dom feel as if the world had made a mistake and was waiting for someone to correct it. Ahn stood beside Dom with her fingers wrapped around his sleeve. She was only 25, kind-hearted, gentle, and too easily moved by sadness. Her grandmother used to say Ahn had a thin soul, not weak in the way people meant insult, but open, like a window left unlatched during a storm. At first, Dom thought grief had made her nervous. Then Ahn leaned closer and said, "She is not here for Min." Dom did not answer right away. Across the room, an old auntie was speaking about another death, a young woman named Linh Pham, who had been found the week before after something terrible had happened to her. People lowered their voices when they mentioned her. They said she had died violently, away from home, without the kind of farewell that lets a soul understand it is dead. The auntie crossed herself in the old local way, even though she was Buddhist, and muttered, "Poor girl. An angry soul does not always know where to go." A monk near the doorway lifted his eyes when she said that. He was an elderly man from a small temple outside town, with a shaved head, tired eyes, and a voice that sounded like rain on stone. He had come to chant for Min, but for one long moment, he looked past the mourners and stared at the smoke. Ahn's hand tightened. Dom whispered, "What is wrong?" Ahn's lips barely moved. "She is crying, Dom, but she is angry too." At the front of the room, the incense smoke bent sideways, not toward the window, not toward the fan, but toward Ahn. It stretched like a thin white finger across the room. Then the candles near Min's photograph flickered once, hard, and Ahn's face changed. It was not dramatic. She did not scream. She did not faint. She simply stopped looking like herself for 1 second, as if another expression had slipped over her face from the inside. Her mouth formed words Dom did not understand, old, low, and bitter. The monk stepped forward and said sharply, "Do not answer her." Ahn blinked, startled, and the room noise rushed back, crying, chanting, whispers, sandals on tile. Dom asked, "Answer who?" The monk looked at him, then at Ahn, and his voice softened, but the fear in it did not. "When you leave this funeral, do not look back if someone calls your name. Do not bring flowers from here into your home. Do not sleep with the door open." Ahn tried to smile politely, but her smile trembled. "Thay, I'm only tired." The monk nodded, as if he had heard that excuse from many people, some living, some not. "Yes," he said. "That is why she noticed you." Outside, the sky over Hoi An was turning the color of old bruises. Lanterns swayed along the street, and rain began to tap gently against the funeral awning. When Dom and Ahn finally left, someone behind them whispered Ahn's name. It was a woman's voice, wet with tears, close enough to breathe against her ear. Ahn stopped. Dom grabbed her hand before she could turn around. He pulled her toward the motorbike and said, "Keep walking." Behind them, beneath the chanting and rain, the same voice whispered again, but this time it used Dom's name too. "Dom, tell them I did not fall." By the time Dom and Ahn reached their small house near the old quarter, the rain had become a silver curtain over the streets. The river smelled swollen, the lanterns looked blurred and sickly in the water, and every alley seemed to hold a shadow that leaned too close. Dom told himself it was only the funeral. Death had a way of changing ordinary things. A wet road became a warning. A dog barking behind a gate became a message. The empty passenger seat on another motorbike became a place where the dead might sit. Ahn did not speak during the ride home. When they entered the house, she went straight to the kitchen sink and washed her hands for a long time. Dom watched the water run over her fingers, over and over, even after the soap was gone. Ahn, he said carefully, "You are hurting your skin." She looked down, surprised, as if the hands belonged to someone else. "I can still smell the flowers," she whispered. Dom tried to make tea. He moved slowly, loudly, doing normal things on purpose, opening cabinets, rinsing cups, turning on lights. But the house would not become normal. The bulbs flickered twice, the way candles had flickered near Min's photograph. Somewhere above the ceiling, something dragged itself across the rafters with a dry, patient sound. Ahn stood at the kitchen entrance and stared at the darkest corner of the room. Dom followed her gaze. There was nothing there. Then Ahn said, "She came inside before you closed the door." Dom felt cold move across his back. He forced a small laugh, but it came out wrong. No one came inside. Ahn turned to him slowly. Her eyes were red, but not from crying. They looked irritated, sleepless, almost bruised around the edges. "She says your house is warm," Ahn said. "She says nobody gave her rice." Dom set the teapot down too hard, and hot water spilled across the counter. "Ahn, stop. You are scaring me." That was when she smiled, not sweetly, not cruelly, but with the exhausted patience of a stranger. "Yam skaitu jonga." Dom froze. Ahn never called him that with such a flat voice. When she said husband, it usually carried affection, teasing home. This time it sounded like a word she had learned from listening through walls. That night, Dom checked the door lock 3 times. He closed every window. He burned incense at the small ancestor shelf near the living room, not because he considered himself deeply religious, but because suddenly he wanted every old protection his family had ever believed in. Ahn sat on the bed, facing the wall. "Come sleep," he said. She did not move. At 1:17 in the morning, Dom woke to the sound of someone crying in the bathroom. He reached across the bed. Ahn was not there. The bathroom door was open. The light was off. Ahn knelt on the floor with her forehead pressed against the tile. Around her, the air smelled of funeral incense, wet soil, and something metallic that made Dom's stomach tighten. "Ahn, baby, get up." She lifted her head. In the mirror above the sink, Dom saw a woman standing behind her, long black hair stuck to her face, one shoulder hanging lower than the other, mouth open as if she had been screaming for days. Dom spun around. The hallway was empty. In the mirror, the woman remained. Ahn spoke without looking at him. "She says they closed her mouth before she could name him." Dom pulled Ahn away from the mirror, and she fought him with a strength that did not belong to her thin arms. Her nails scraped his wrist. Her voice changed, breaking into 2 sounds at once, Ahn's frightened breath and another woman's grief underneath it. "Ask him about the bridge," she hissed. "Ask him about the red raincoat." Then she collapsed against Dom, sobbing like a child. He held her until morning, but neither of them slept. At dawn, Dom found wet footprints beginning at the front door, crossing the living room, and ending at the foot of their bed. They were too small to be his. They were too muddy to be Ahn's. And beside each print, pressed into the dust, was the shape of a bare knee, as if someone had crawled through the house in the dark, looking for a body that could still breathe. Dom did not tell his family at first, because families turn fear into arguments and arguments into blame. He only called one person, his childhood friend Bao, who had become a police officer in Da Nang and still answered the phone like he was expecting bad news. Bao listened without interrupting. When Dom finished, there was a long silence on the line. Then Bao said, "The woman from last week, Lin Pham, she was not supposed to be discussed outside the investigation." Dom sat at the kitchen table, staring at Ahn's closed bedroom door. "What bridge?" he asked. Bao's voice lowered. "Why are you asking about a bridge?" "Because my wife said it last night, but it was not my wife speaking." Bao cursed softly. "Dom, listen to me. I cannot tell you everything, but Lin was last seen near Cam Nam Bridge. She was wearing a red raincoat. That detail was not in the news." Dom closed his eyes. Inside the bedroom, Ahn laughed. It was a small sound, almost polite, and it made the hair on Dom's arms rise. Bao said, "Take her to a doctor." "I will," Dom said, because that was the answer a sane man gave. But when he opened the bedroom door, Ahn was standing in front of the mirror, drawing on the glass with a fingertip. There was no ink, no lipstick, no blood, only fog from her breath, and still the letters appeared one by one. Linh. Ahn whispered, "She says you know men who wear uniforms, so you must help." Dom stepped toward her. "Ahn, can you hear me?" Her head tilted. For 1 second, her eyes filled with tears, and Ahn was there, trapped behind her own face. "Dom, I keep dreaming that I am underground, but I can't hear my mother calling me from far away. Please make it stop." Then her expression hardened again. The room chilled until Dom could see his breath. The voice that came from Ahn's mouth was softer now, more controlled, and far more terrifying because of it. He washed his hands in the river, but the water remembered. Dom backed away. "Ooh." Ahn smiled, and the smile cracked into a sob. He smelled like cigarettes and lotus oil. That afternoon, Dom took her to a clinic. The doctor said exhaustion, trauma, shock from the funeral. He gave her something mild to help her sleep, and Dom wanted desperately to believe him. For 6 hours, the medicine worked. Ahn slept. Her breathing became steady. Dom sat beside her, watching her face become young again, his wife again, the woman who had once cried because a street vendor gave them extra banh mi and refused payment. Then at sunset, every phone in the house rang at once. Dom's mobile. Ahn's mobile. The old landline they never used. All 3 screens showed the same number. 000000000. Dom answered his mobile with a shaking hand. At first there was only static, then distant chanting, then a woman weeping through what sounded like rain. Ahn's eyes opened. The voice on the phone said, "I am far from home." Dom dropped the phone. Ahn sat up, smiling with someone else's mouth. "She remembers the soldiers," Ahn said. "She remembers the old tape, the dead calling from the trees, telling men they would wander if they were not buried. They used fear as a weapon then, but this is not a tape, Dom. This is her." The landline kept ringing. Dom ripped it from the wall. The ringing continued. That was when Ahn began naming things she could not know. The color of Bao's first police motorbike. The scar on Min's father's hand. The alley where Lin had bought flowers the day she disappeared. And then, in a whisper that made Dom feel as if a grave had opened under the house, she named a man. Nguyen Tân Vu. Dom wrote it down. Ahn looked at the paper, and her face twisted with grief. "No," she whispered in her own voice. "Dom, I did not say that." But the letters were already there. That night, as rain pressed against the windows, Dom called a monk from Min's funeral. He did not need to explain much. The monk only said, "Bring her before noon. If she has begun giving names, then she is not merely following anymore. She is using your wife to finish what the living refused to hear." The temple sat beyond the busiest streets of Hoi An, where the houses thinned, the road narrowed, and the rice fields held the morning mist like folded cloth. It was not large. Its roof tiles were dark with age, its courtyard smelled of rainwater and incense ash, and its bell hung beneath a wooden beam carved with dragons whose faces had been softened by time. The monk's name was Thay Veen. He met Dom and Ahn at the gate, and the moment he saw her, he lowered his eyes with sadness, not surprise. "She is deep inside," he said. Dom tightened his arm around Ahn's shoulders. "Can you help her?" Thay Veen did not answer quickly. He studied Ahn's face, the grayness around her mouth, the way she watched the altar without blinking. "I can help both of them," he said at last, "if the angry one still remembers she was human." Inside the prayer hall, 3 younger monks prepared offerings on low tables. There was rice, water, fruit, flowers, salt, candles, and folded paper goods meant for the dead. Incense was lit in careful groups, and the smoke rose straight at first, then curled toward Ahn like a living thing recognizing its path. Ahn began to cry before anyone touched her. Dom knelt beside her. "I am here." She gripped his wrist. "Do not let me answer if she calls from behind me." The chanting began softly. It was not like the loud, dramatic rituals from movies. It was steady, patient, almost tender. The monks chanted as if speaking to someone wounded behind a locked door. The drumbeat came slowly, 1 heartbeat at a time, and the bell answered with a bright note that made the air tremble. For the first hour, Ahn only wept. For the second hour, she whispered in a voice Dom could not understand. For the third hour, she looked at Thay Veen and said, "You fed the others, but nobody fed me." The monk bowed his head. "Lin Pham, if that is your name, these offerings are for you." Ann's face tightened, resisting. Thaveen continued, "You were harmed. You were afraid. You died with terror in your body, and now your anger has become a road. But this woman is not your enemy. Ahn did not hurt you." The spirit laughed through Ahn, and the sound was broken, ugly, full of wet grief. "I followed the softest light," she said. She opened when she pitied the dead. Ann's body bent forward, and Dom reached for her, but one of the younger monks stopped him with a gentle hand. Thaveen placed a bowl of rice near the incense. "Eat without taking," he said. "Speak without harming." For a moment, nothing happened. Then every grain of rice in the bowl trembled. Ahn lifted her head. Her eyes were full of tears, but the voice was not hers. "He told me nobody would search for me. He told me I was already a ghost before I died." Dom felt something inside him go still. "Ooh." Ann's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her throat strained. The candles guttered. Outside, although there was no wind, the temple bell began to swing by itself. Thaveen raised his voice in chant, not louder from fear, but stronger, like a rope thrown into deep water. Ahn screamed. The sound did not seem to come from her chest. It came from the corners of the room, from beneath the floorboards, from the old wood, from the mouths of all the dead who had ever waited for someone to remember them. When the scream ended, Ahn collapsed. On the offering paper in front of her, written in ash, was one word: "Vuo." Dom stared at it until the letters blurred. Thaveen covered the ash with a white cloth. "This is the first night," he said. "Tonight she will test the doors. She will try to make you angry. She will try to make Ahn afraid enough to let go. You must not shout at your wife, and you must not bargain with the spirit in your own words." Dom swallowed. "What do I do?" The monk looked toward Ahn, who lay trembling on a floor, her lips moving in a silent conversation with someone only she could hear. "You love her," he said. "You keep calling her back by name." The first night at the temple was the longest night of Dom's life. Ahn slept on a thin mat near the prayer hall, but sleep did not hold her gently. Her hands twitched. Her lips moved. Sometimes she whispered Dom's name with love, and sometimes she whispered it with such hatred that he had to remind himself the voice was only borrowing her mouth. Near midnight, she sat up and said, "Your husband cannot save you, because he will doubt you before sunrise." Dom almost answered. Thaveen touched his shoulder. "Do not feed it with argument." So Dom knelt beside Ahn and spoke as if she could hear him from very far away. "Ahn, it is Dom. I am here. Remember our house. Remember the yellow cup you said was ugly, but kept because I bought it with my first paycheck. Remember the river lantern we released after our wedding. Come back to me." Ahn's eyes filled with tears. "For a breath," she returned. Then the lamps went out. In the darkness, something crawled across the ceiling. The younger monks began chanting immediately. Dom heard nails tapping above him, slow and deliberate. Then a woman's voice whispered from the rafters, "I had a husband once, but I never got to go home." Thaveen lit a candle from the altar flame. The ceiling was empty, but Ahn's hair was wet, as if rain had fallen only on her. On the second day, Bao came to the temple in plain clothes. He stood outside the gate with Dom, smoking without lighting the cigarette, rolling it nervously between his fingers. "I checked the name," Bao said. "Winton Vuo thou." He was interviewed once briefly, because he worked near the road where Lin disappeared. No evidence, no witness, no reason to hold him. Dom looked back toward the prayer hall. "There is evidence now." Bao's face hardened. "A possessed woman naming a suspect is not evidence." "I know. But the bridge, the red raincoat, the lotus oil, those details matter," Bao said. "I can reopen questions quietly. I can look again." Dom's throat tightened. She said he washed his hands in the river. Bao finally lit the cigarette, took one pull, and crushed it out immediately. "Then I will start with the river." That evening, the ritual changed. Thaveen said the first day had been for calling, the second for listening, and the third would be for release. He placed a white bowl of water before Ahn, then asked the spirit to show what she needed. At first, the water reflected only candlelight. Then the surface darkened. Dom saw a road slick with rain, a red raincoat torn against weeds, a motorbike mirror cracked like a broken moon, a man's hand, shaking, dropping a small jade bracelet into mud near the bridge. Ahn sobbed. My mother gave me that bracelet. Thay Veen bowed his head. Lin, you have been heard. The spirit turned Ahn's face toward him. He breathes. I do not. No, the monk said gently. Your revenge will not make you alive. Then give me justice. That is for the living to carry, Thay Veen said. Not for you to steal a body and burn in it. The spirit began to cry. It was the first time Dom felt more sorrow than terror. The sound was young. Lin had not become a monster because she wanted to. She had died in fear, been hidden by silence, and woken into a world where everyone spoke around her death, but nobody spoke to her. On the third night, the monks prepared a larger offering. Rice, fruit, tea, paper money, paper clothing, and a small paper house were arranged beneath the altar. Thay Veen chanted for wandering souls, for the hungry dead, for those with no one to call their names, and for those whose anger had chained them to the place where pain began. Ahn trembled so violently Dom thought her bones might break. Then suddenly she went still. Her eyes opened. Dom, she whispered. He leaned close. Ahn, she is tired, Ahn said. She wants to see her mother. Thay Veen lifted a stick of incense and spoke as if addressing someone standing just beyond the candlelight. Lin Pham, daughter, wounded soul, listen carefully. You do not have to forgive the man who harmed you. You do not have to forget your pain. But you must release the living woman you are holding and let the path open. Ahn's mouth quivered. Another voice came through, weaker now. If I go, will he be caught? Dom did not know whether he was allowed to speak, but Thay Veen nodded once. Dom said, I promise I will not stop. Bao will not stop. We will find him. The temple bell rang once by itself. Ahn exhaled, and a cold wind moved out of her so sharply that every candle leaned away. For the first time in 3 days, her face became only her own. She fell into Dom's arms and whispered, Please take me home. Ahn did not remember everything. She remembered the funeral, the woman behind the altar, the smell of rain, and then pieces like broken dishes swept into a corner. A bathroom mirror. A red raincoat. Rice trembling in a bowl. Dom's voice calling her name again and again, as if he were standing on one riverbank while she drifted away from the other. For a week after the ritual, she slept with a lamp on. Dom did not complain. Every morning, he made tea. Every evening, he burned incense at the ancestor shelf and thanked anyone listening for allowing his wife to wake up as herself. Bao kept his promise. He returned to the bridge with 2 officers he trusted. They searched the mud below the old stone edge, where the rainwater gathered before spilling toward the river. At first, they found nothing but bottles, plastic, and rotten leaves. Then one officer saw a glint of green beneath a clump of grass. It was a jade bracelet cracked through the middle. The next day, Bao found a mechanic who remembered replacing a broken mirror on Nguyen Tan Vu's motorbike. After that came a shopkeeper who had sold lotus oil to him the same week Lin vanished. Then came camera footage, poor and grainy, but enough to show his motorbike near the bridge after midnight. A week after Dom stood before the altar and promised a dead woman justice, Bao called. We arrested him, he said. Dom sat down slowly. Did he confess? Not fully. Men like that rarely give the truth all at once, Bao said. But we have enough to hold him, and more is coming. Dom looked toward Ahn, who was watering basil in a clay pot by the window. Sunlight touched her face, and for the first time since Min's funeral, she looked peaceful. Lin, Dom asked. Bao was quiet. Then he said, her mother came to the station today. She brought a photograph. She asked me why she dreamed of Lin wearing clean clothes and holding a bowl of rice. Dom could not speak. That evening, Dom and Ahn returned to Thay Veen's temple. The monk listened as Dom told him about the arrest. He did not smile, but his face softened in a way that made him seem much older and much lighter at the same time. Justice does not erase suffering, he said, but sometimes it opens the door. They lit incense for Min. They lit incense for Lin. They lit incense for every spirit whose name had been lost in rain, war, water, roads, and silence. Ahn stood beside Dom, holding his hand. I hated her for taking me, she said softly. Thay Veen note that? That is understandable. But when she left, Ahn whispered, I felt how lonely she was. The monk placed a small red thread around Ahn's wrist. Compassion must have boundaries. Never confuse an open heart with an open door. Months passed. Life returned in cautious pieces. Dom fixed the landline but never plugged it back in. Ahn stopped waking in the bathroom. The wet footprints did not return. When funeral music drifted from distant streets, she closed the window, not from disrespect, but because some sounds remembered the way to her. On the 49th day after Lynn's proper rites, her family held a ceremony. Dom and Ahn attended, but they stood near the back. Offerings were placed neatly before Lynn's photograph. She looked young in it, younger than the grief attached to her name. As the monks chanted, the incense smoke rose straight upward, not sideways, not toward Ahn, straight upward, as if someone had finally found a road. Dom felt Ahn's hand relax. For a while, neither of them moved. Then a paper flower slipped from the offering table and landed at Ahn's feet. It was white, folded carefully, and there was a single gray fingerprint on one petal, made of ash. Ahn picked it up. On the underside, written so faintly Dom almost missed it, were two words. Gamun. Thank you. Dom wanted that to be the end of the story. Most days, he tells himself it was. But sometimes, years later, when they pass a funeral house and the chanting is low, Ahn grows quiet. Sometimes the air in the motorbike mirror darkens, though there is nothing behind them. Sometimes, if rain falls hard enough, Dom hears a woman weeping near the road, not begging anymore, only warning. And whenever they leave a funeral now, Dom never lets Ahn walk behind him. He holds her hand. He keeps his eyes forward. Because in Hoi An, where lanterns tremble on black water and incense smoke writes messages the living are not meant to read, the dead do not always follow the cruel. Sometimes they follow the kind.